Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on this terrific Tuesday for the Hunt Institute's Race and Education webinar on the invisible tax, educators of color and the water that they carry. We're so grateful that you could join us for our wonderful panel of experts, Dr. Tahita Baker-Jones, Chief Equity and Social Justice Officer at Atlanta Public Schools, Carla Vigil, co-founder and chief connector of the Equity Institute, and Jose Luis Vilson, co-founder and executive director of EduColor. And moderating today's conversation will be Dr. Maurice Sweeney, chief equity officer of the Chicago Public Schools. Thank you to our wonderful resource experts for leading us in today's conversation on the invisible tax, educators of color, and the water they carry. For those of you who are joining us, we're also grateful that you have decided to tune in. We want to hear your perspectives, your engagements, your thoughts, your comments during today's webinar. Feel free to use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to post those questions and comments. But we also want to hear from you online through Twitter with our hashtag Race and Education webinar hashtag. Please make sure to use the hashtag Race and Ed webinar during today's conversation to let us know your thoughts, your engagements, your perspectives. We want to hear from you because it helps us shape these conversations moving forward. Our president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, could not join us for today, but for those of you who are joining for the first time, the Hunt Institute was created by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt to be an education policy resource for state leaders looking to advance equity in education. This webinar series is a continuation of that work, lifting up the most salient conversations that live at the intersection between race and American public education. Today, we have an amazing panel of colleagues who are advocating on behalf of our educators of color. The national teacher shortage in this country is a serious economic and social problem, yet many are unaware that we are facing an additional million-person large gap of educators of color. The racial and ethnic gap for teachers has widened over the last 10 years as the population remains not representatives of the students that they are serving. Recruiting and retaining our teachers of color is difficult because in addition to the workforce, salary issues, and challenges within educator preparation programs, our educators of color are carrying the burden of being the voices of diversity and inclusion in their school communities. Often they are expected to be the only voice on cultural diversity when they are called to be school disciplinarians, and when they have to be the ones to prepare students for racism in the classroom and outside of the classroom. This phenomenon is called the invisible tax. It's paid by our educators of color and by their advocates. Recently, our president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, and Dan Weisberg, CEO of TNTP, wrote about the need to recruit 1 million new teachers of color into the education workforce. But to close the diversity gap, we must also tackle this invisible tax paid by those educators as they come in. A special thank you to our amazing team behind the scenes, Jen, Sophie, Michelle, Julia, and Abigail. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Sweeney to begin today's conversation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am really thankful and grateful to share this space with three phenomenal individuals who are deeply committed to racial equity, who love people, who show up authentically. And it is really always an honor that I can have the opportunity just to talk with them and connect. I am Dr. Maurice Sweeney, Chief Equity Officer here at Chicago Public Schools. We made some commitments in a 5-year vision in 2018. And despite the pandemic, we are forging ahead with ensuring that Black and Brown people get what they need within the system. So many things are happening. We're guided by a CPS equity framework that keeps us with tunnel vision. And we know that in order to really advance equity work, we have to talk about mindsets, relationships and partnerships, resources and policy. And so when we think about the invisible tax, it has a relationship to all of those things. And when we talk about recruiting folks and finding more people, we have to also recognize what is the undue burden that might have pushed people out of the system. And how do we think about what does it mean to restore the brilliance and the passion and the quantity, if you will, of people of color within the system. So I'm excited to get into this real conversation. In my head, we're sitting around in the living room, talking, making meaning together, sharing some insights. So, you know, I think many of you will have questions that we may be able to answer at some point, but we do have some things we just really want to share and connect. So thank you to all of the panelists, and they're all the bottom, and I'm gonna let them all introduce themselves, centering around this particular question. What are the challenges that are defined by the invisible tax paid by educators of color? And let me say one more thing about invisible tax. I went to Ghana in 2018, and we were moving in different areas in that beautiful country. And I watched Black people, beautiful African people, carry water with such grace and resiliency in ways that reminded me that even though it is a tax and the things that people are holding space for, people of color, particularly Black people, are doing it with such grace. And so I just want to give a shout out to all of the educators out there to say, we see you, we love you, we hear you, and we stand with you in this work. And so with that, I'll say the question again, add a little more to it. What are the challenges that define the invisible tax paid by educators of color? And how are you, in your scope of work, in your relationships, helping educators of color carry that burden? And what are the burdens resting on the shoulders as advocates for educators of color? So I know that's a lot, so you can tackle that in the way that you want to. And I'll first start with my friend, mentee, Chief Equity Officer in Atlanta Public Schools. Dr. Baker, if you would mind taking it away.
Yeah, thank you. Zoom challenges, right? Thank you, Dr. Swinney. And similar to you, I too am grateful to be here with esteemed colleagues today, talking, listening, and learning. You know, the invisible tax is real, and I feel it in my work, not only here in Atlanta, but in my work historically. And just to introduce myself, as you mentioned, I am the Chief Equity and Social Justice Officer here at Atlanta Public Schools. I am the first Chief Equity Officer in Atlanta Public Schools, which comes with an inordinate amount of tax in and of itself, being the first in this space, right? Working to create the district's first office solely dedicated to advancing equity within our school system. And so all of that entails, we'll talk about later, in the tax that comes with being the first to bring in difficult conversations and shed light on unpleasant truths as our community works to grapple with some of the historical inequities and challenges that it has faced in our sector. But to your questions about what are some of these challenges in the invisible tax paid by educators of color, I would mention two, and I would add that one, you know, many organizations are trying to diversify their staff and their team at this time, and they've hired people of color not fully knowing and understanding what that means for them as an organization. And so looking at my organization, for example, is taking up the charge of equity. That is a tall task for the city of Atlanta, which has deep roots in the civil rights movement and comes with that history and that baggage that is bringing to this work that we're doing. And not only APS, but any organization that is looking to do something or diversify in that realm, and they may not fully understand the mindset shift and the shift in the ways of working that are inherent in what diversity mandates. So as a person of color, one of the taxes that I've experienced, and I know some of my colleagues have experienced, is navigating this space of people wanting diversity, but not truly understanding the shifts that they will have to make because of your presence. And so you begin pushing for inclusion and equity, because there's a difference between those three terms. And because you're pushing for inclusion and equity, because that is required for you to be successful in that space, you then become the face of that issue, if you will, or whatever the concern is that you may be attempting to address. And so then it follows that in order to get rid of the issue, because you're creating discomfort for folks, then they must get rid of you. And so there's that tension and that worry and that tax and that anxiety that you feel trying to tread that thin line that just becomes stressful in and of itself. But then there's this second tax I feel that I know me personally I experience, which is carrying the waters, which is the title of this workshop, carrying the waters of the folks in the community who your presence represents. Especially if you were hired to be in a leadership role, serving and representing the rank and file people of color. And so because you gain credibility amongst that stakeholder group by demonstrating your capacity to take on their problems and concerns and address them, that too becomes stressful. Because if you aren't ride or dying hard enough or to their liking, then you have that tension that you're dealing with. So you have this tension on both sides as you walk this fine line. And that's taxing in and of itself, trying to walk that fine line politically and navigate both of those spaces. And so I will leave it there in answer to your question. And those are the two taxes that I feel in my current role I'm experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And I'm curious to hear from my colleagues, if that resonates with them and how have they tackled and addressed them in their spaces, their spheres of influence.
Thanks, I appreciate that. With that, Carla is next on my screen. She's a brilliant CEO and co-founder of the Equity Institute. I'll just let you pick it up from there. What's coming up for you?
Yeah, no, everything Dr. Baker said for sure. And I think I could just add on to some of the things that she pointed out that are definitely issues that we encounter as educators and as leaders of color doing this work. I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. You introduced me, but I'll just tell you a little bit more about me. I'm from Providence. I was born in El Salvador. I was my first language is Spanish. Have been in Providence ever since, and really ride and die for my community here. And so a lot of the work that I've done is based in Providence, and we've just recently been able to expand our work nationally to do work in different states. But I say that because a lot of the things I'm going to talk about is really rooted in community, and it's community driven. And we really believe that, and we value that and embody those principles grounded in community. In terms of what are the challenges that define invisible tax, there's so many. We're being taxed so much. It's crazy. One of the things, I'm going to talk from my experience. So I was a teacher 4 years ago. Hold up. I got to put my time because I don't want to go over 4 minutes. I was a teacher 4 years ago. I was pushed out. So I think, Dr. Baker, you talked about that. You end up getting pushed out. I didn't want to stop teaching. I struggled that summer really hard. I had two boys. I was a single mom, and did not have a teaching job. And I applied to many schools, even my local school in Providence, and was not being hired. And by the way, I was a good teacher. But some of the things that we experienced, or that I experienced in my classroom, was like the extra work. For instance, I had to redesign all my curriculum because it was not equitable. It was not done from an anti-racist lens. And so a lot of my time was being in the school from 7 to 5, and then designing and preparing my lessons because they did not, the standard curriculum was not up to par and did not speak to the work that I wanted to do with my babies. Another thing is being tokenized. So the institution itself was not culturally responsive to my identity. I was older, I had kids, I taught in a school, it was a charter school, and it was one of those no excuses schools. So I didn't fit in. They kicked me out real fast. And they were not responsive to my identity. It was a lot of young white teachers, and so they didn't have families. I had families, and I had to come every morning and stand in a circle at 7:45 and leave my babies at home and have them walk to school to be in community with them. But it was taking a toll on me mentally and physically. And so that's another piece of the invisible tax: the extra work, the mental exhaustion, the physical exhaustion. But going back to the tokenizing, the school wasn't responsive to my identity. And in addition to that, they loved my classroom. So they used my classroom to show the community and their stakeholders, the lieutenant governor, other officials, like, come look at Carla's beautiful classroom. She has diversity things on the wall. She's talking about these things with the kids. We're really about diversity here. So that was another piece that I was like, there's something going on here. There's something wrong. So in 2014, I was kicked out, and this kind of segues into how are we helping educators of color. So basically, a year later, we formed a people-centered initiative that focused on convening educators and leaders of color in Rhode Island. And it was a group of us because that year that I was pushed out, there were 5 Black and brown teachers that also left. And so we were like, what is going on? Are we doing something wrong? Like, what do we need to do to fit in the system? And we quickly realized it was not us, it was the system and systemic issues in the institutions that needed to change. And so we were bright, we were intelligent, and so we wanted to create space for us, for our people and our community to connect, to build social capital, and also to think of innovative ways to solve the problem. We're not just going to complain about it, we are going to solve it. And so Edu Leaders of Color Rhode Island was born. We also realized soon after that the work needed to go beyond the community. And so we needed to make change at the district level and state level. So that's when we began our learning labs and working with districts. We know we have work to do to recruit and retain teachers, but we got to do something with the teachers we have in our districts right now. So we started developing training workshops for districts and schools so that their teachers were well equipped to teach from an equitable and anti-racist lens. And lastly, we have developed a program that leverages the folks in the community now. So teacher assistants, we call it TA to BA, teacher assistants to bachelor degrees. So we're leveraging teacher assistants that are in the community already, that have been, there's my time, that have been part of the community and teaching for a long time, helping them get their bachelor's degree so that they could get certified. There's many other things that we're doing, but I'll leave y'all with that. And I'm gonna pass the mic to you, back to you, Dr. Sweeney, so we could hear from Jose.
Thank you. I appreciate the way which you describe coalition building and community as the response to being pushed out. That's real dope. Jose, Executive Director of Educolor, tell us about you and just what's coming up for you as you hear about the invisible tax.
Well, before this year, I was a 15-year educator in Washington Heights. Shout out to Washington Heights in New York City. And y'all know who y'all are. And then, of course, doing that work in the middle schools for 15 years as a middle schooler, like I recognized so many of the inequities already. And I really came into that setting from a social justice standpoint. And of course, Executive Director of Educolor and currently a doctoral student studying sociology and education at Teachers College, Columbia University, among any number of different roles. I'm most proud of being a family man and a dad. But with all that said, I think it's important for us to do a little bit of reframing in the sense of saying that, it isn't just that we're burnt, that we are burnt out, is that someone is lighting that match. Specifically that, we have structural and personal and it's, real structural issues that are going on with why we don't stay. And of course, you can point to any number of factors. Then, focus on pay, for example. There's only so many of us who actually have intergenerational wealth because, if you're somebody, and I can speak from experiences, when you're somebody who has to get that middle class degree, you end up paying back to, to your pops, to your moms, to your abuela, whoever that is back home. So teachers don't get paid enough for us to be able to do that. So that necessarily already cuts us off from being recruited. But then even so, ever since I think 1986, I want to say it is, when we first started recording teacher demographics across race, we are at the highest clip of teacher recruitment for educators of color, but obviously we're leaving way faster than our white counterparts. And this invisible tax is so critical to that because it's the stuff that is intangible and unfortunately very real, right? And so when I think about so many of the ways that we talk about culturally responsive education, I think about how educators of color, when they get into different classrooms, they're able to reframe what it means to be gifted and talented, for example, what it means to actually be thoughtful about those who can actually go into STEM careers, folks who can actually push people into alternative paths, all sorts of paths, and still make the students feel like they're welcome in the classroom. Because as we know from so many people, so many scholars from before, teachers of color are more likely to focus on the relationship first and then the academic second, because how can they trust you with their brains if they can't trust you with their hearts? Those are things that keep coming up for me as I keep studying this stuff. And so a lot of this invisible text can really be simplified to, do people feel seen when they're in the classroom? Do they feel seen when they're in the school building? And too often the folks who leave, who get burnt, is because they don't feel seen in the spaces that they're in. And so too often when we bring up issues, whether it be about the ways that so many of our Black boys and girls consistently get kicked out of their classrooms for minor infractions at 6 to 8 times the rate of their white counterparts, that has a lot to do with being seen and feeling seen, and wondering why we feel like it's okay to continually punish our children of color when their white counterparts don't get that much punishment. We think about even metal detectors and what police presence is there for in specific school settings. For some kids, it's to help them feel welcome. And in so many of our settings, so many Black settings and Latinx and Native American settings, it's no, actually, we need to keep ourselves safe from you. And that's the issue, and that's a reframing that we need to continue to talk about, because when teachers of color go into buildings, and again, like, you study this stuff and you say to yourself, all right, well, teachers of color generally don't necessarily care about which school they go to. They end up getting hired in spaces that are predominantly Black and Latinx because that's the opportunity they're given. But then fine. Once they go to those spaces, though, they're hoping to change those spaces from the places when they were children. But unfortunately, if it continues to reify the oppression that happened when they were children, they re-experience the trauma that they were going through, that they were once hoping to change. And so those are things that I'm hoping, organizations like EduColor, any number of organizations that were already mentioned, and of course, individually and collectively, any number of people doing this sort of work, great on them. And we have to continually push on this community piece, because that's the only way we end up surviving in these spaces until we create the structures in place. And so I'm grateful to be in this panel, specifically because I know we have co-workers on this panel who could speak to this issue from that organizational standpoint, so we can finally find a way to dismantle and deconstruct that which continues to oppress so many of our educators of color.
Ooh, talk about a good kickoff. I remember, thank you all. I'm 20 years in public education. So this is like my anniversary year that I'm very excited about. And when I look back at my own personal schooling, I'm originally from New Orleans. I've had over 20 Black teachers throughout my school career. And so I've always felt affirmed and celebrated and pushed to be excellent. It's because of Ms. Strickland and Ms. Murray that I became an educator and I sit in this seat. And when I became an assistant principal in a majority white setting of about 2,000 students, I learned a part of the lens that I honestly didn't have. I was an HBCU graduate, so my celebration of Blackness and culture were always at the forefront. And what I found was there was a tax put on me as an administrator to solve a lot of Black issues. And I don't always think it's about like people's intent, but I do know the impact. And I tell people, I'm not trying to always assess one's intention. I can tell you directly what the impact was. So recently in Chicago Public Schools, I did a focus group with Black male students, Black male teachers, and Black male principals. And what I found, I'm searching for a through line in some data points. And what I found from Black teachers, they all described what you talked about, Carla, like these extra expectations that don't necessarily come with supports, or in some ways, are not given support. And what does that mean for us as an organization? And how do we need to continue to think through that so that we don't lose the precious stones of these beautiful souls who are doing this work in our schools? So you shared some insights about your work in Rhode Island. I'm going to give you an opportunity to bless all of us who are working in systems, whether we're equity officers or people trying to figure it out. What policy recommendations would help to promote the development of more racially, culturally, and linguistic inclusive education workforce? Like, what should us who are holding the structures and the institutions in place, like Jose described, need to be focused on right now?
I go first. Okay.
Yeah, I switched the order.
I saw that. I was expecting the order that was on the paper. But it's okay. It's okay. Okay, so in terms of policy recommendations, there's a lot. Like I got like papers, reports. I mean, they're everywhere. Like I don't think we have any lack of information. There's a lot of written material out there on what we need, and it's so much. So I'm just gonna point out a couple, or maybe a few, as to what we need. We in Rhode Island, we're advocating here and trying to work with legislators here, policymakers, to create change. That's part of the work, because we could do everything we want to do in the classroom. If it's not changing at the policy level, that's where the power is at. So there's like a power obviously play there, and so we recognize that. We have a huge problem just nationally. We all know that. That's why we're here. Even if we do everything right, it's not changing. It's not going to change the numbers that we want to see. We know that. So we're all going to have jobs for a very, very long time. And we're going to pass this on to the next generation. But one of the things that I do want to name and point out is certification. And the reason I want to point this out is because when I went and I got my master's to become a teacher, I had to take the math 8 times, and I took the science praxis 6 times. I'm not even playing. Like when I passed the math, I sat there and I was like, is this for real? Did I just pass it? The people that knew me, they were like, oh, Carla's here again. Carla's here again. And I was just trying to get certified. And the irony in that is that's when I was pushed out from the school I was teaching at, was not hired again. So that certification piece is so important because it did so much to my self-esteem. It made me feel like I wasn't adequate enough. It made me feel like I didn't know the content. And we know that's not true. We already have research that says that your capability to be a teacher is not tied to standardized tests. And we could go into a whole conversation about that being true. Even for our babies in the classroom, we know standardized tests are grounded in racist ideologies and policies that go way back. And here we are still feeling the impact of it. And it's really why we're in the positions that we still are today. So one of the biggest things we're pushing for is changing the certification, coming up with alternative ways. But we need to be reaching people who are making these decisions. And I really don't know who they are. So I'm still doing that research. Every time in my state, they say no, I'm like, who are these people? I need to go and talk to them. We need to be at the table thinking about how do you change, because it's a systemic and institutional issue, but these are people making the decision. So there is a possibility to create change. Some other ones are really increasing the support for districts to develop and expand their recruitment efforts. And of course, not just their recruitment, but also their retention efforts as well. Requiring best practices in districts would be great, like having affinity groups, but knowing how to do that well with intentionality around that. So not just saying, yeah, we're gonna have an affinity group and not knowing really how to set that up, because that can also create harm. And then the other thing I wanna highlight, and I have 1 minute left, is the higher ed institution, right? This is on them too. Like, what are y'all doing up there? Like, they are not recruiting students. They are pushing students out. They are taking seniors in that they have to have a certain test score before they go into teaching. We need more teaching initiatives and teaching programs that not just take in BIPOC folks, but also give them scholarships, also prepare them well, because we are saying we need more teachers of color, but we also need teachers of color that are skilled and have that lens in terms of how to teach with an equity lens and an anti-racist lens as well. So the whole program itself needs some work. And so I would stop there. But again, you all seen pages of recommendations. So, and it has to be happening on different levels. So state, federal, and district level as well, all at the same time.
Thank you. One of the reasons I wanted to start with policy is because here's the harm I think comes in these conversations that I'm seeing is when we talk with teachers, especially teachers of color, about change, it always seems to fall on the burden of responsibility for transformation falls on their shoulders. And it's always like, here you are asking me to do something again, and the institution is not making that change. So I appreciate that. I failed the English praxis 3 times, And part of the reason I felt it, I was not concerned about British or American literature. I was more concerned about African literature and the Harlem Renaissance. And so it wasn't until someone told me, read a 6th grade text that was predominantly white, that I passed it with ease. And I thought, because it was all about content, it wasn't about really sort of like learning and development and all that stuff. So
one last thing I'll say is that here's how I passed. I got a tutor and he told me, if you don't know the answer, choose C. I swear to you, that's how I passed.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a tip for everybody. I figure C is a long-standing bubble in. Let's go with Dr. Baker. Let's move down from policy to classroom. What role do educators of color, maybe it's not just classroom, but what role do educators of color play in making schools equitable and inclusive learning environments? And how do you as an equity leader make difficult decisions that you need to move your work while also managing community expectations? And I know it never moves quick enough to respond to the need when you're trying to do institutional change. So if you could just share with us some tactics and emotions that go into that to help us out.
Yeah, one, I want to double tap on what you said about the burden of the work falling on teachers and staff of color and how they're like shouldering that work. And I think that ties in nicely to your question of what role do educators play in making schools or institutions more equitable. And for me, my response would be, as an educator of color in any space, but particularly in predominantly white spaces, your very existence is the revolution, period, the end. And so as my executive coach just shared with me recently, sometimes that's enough. And she asked me a really pointed question. She said, are you being paid to be a martyr? And honestly, is there enough money that you could be paid to take on the spiritual, physical, and emotional distress that sometimes comes along with shouldering this responsibility of making schools or organizations more equitable and inclusive? And if we're honest, that's not the work of one person or even one team, right? We are working to undo centuries of systems and structures that we didn't create, and that quite honestly were created in opposition to or against us. So those individuals, or the descendants of those individuals who created those systems and structures, must take the lead in dismantling them. And our role is to expose the impact that those systems are having and not be complicit in them. And so that's what I would use as an answer to your question. And so with that being said, the work shouldn't fall primarily on educators of color to make institutions more inclusive and equitable. That work should come at the organizational level and the leadership level, and leaders should be working to create environments that are more equitable and inclusive of individuals of colors, and shifting the mindset so that people of color are not simply brought to the table to be like the sprinkling of diversity, if you will, or the dash of diversity, salt on the meal, but that equity and diversity are actually the table that the entire meal is presented on. Because the core of this work has its roots in racism and oppression, which run real deep in our country. And so how you would be a fool to think that that also doesn't form the bedrock of the structural organization that you're creating. And so that burden alone is a tax to put that on people of color. But how can they actually support? Once again, I said to go back to not being implicit and to expose when these systems and structures rear their ugly heads. You could do that by sharing your stories, challenging those systems and structures of supremacy where you see them, and discussing, to your point, Maurice, the impact of those. So not assessing intent, but keeping the conversation and story and focus on impact. That's one way in which you could do that. And that helps to shift the mindsets of individuals, because it gets at the heart of that inter and intrapersonal work that this work requires and involves. But once again, it's systemic because you can't legislate goodwill. And so the organization needs to work to create processes and systems that are so airtight that the ambivalent intentions are inclusive by default, and that those with bad intentions cannot survive within the organization. And that's the work that I am working to do as a leader. Ensuring that there's accountability and there's transparency from us as decision makers and those who are trying to implement change, so that individuals who may have those bad or ill intents, we have accountability structures in place to weed those individuals out and make sure that they're not creating a culture or an environment that are hostile and professionally traumatic for people of color. And so that's the work that I'm doing here as a leader in APS, and also through my work with the Teacher Impact Collaborative, where we're trying to develop an assessment tool to really assess if an organization's culture is even ready to have the benefit and privilege of having people of color embedded within it, because it's about inclusivity and equity. And like I mentioned previously, people may not fully understand, that's my timer, the work that really all entails when you're saying you're bringing people of color on and people of color into an organization. And so I think the responsibility is bifocal. One, the primary responsibility falls on the shoulders of the leaders of the organization, like myself, and then people of color just sharing their experiences and discussing impact when those interpersonal and interpersonal relationships warrant that they do so.
Thank you. We just updated our non-discrimination policy to include microaggressions, because we know that is a tactic that pushes people out of systems, that is very interpersonal in some ways. And Dr. Jackson created, when she became CEO of Chicago Public Schools, talking about leadership, we created the Great Expectations Mentoring Program, which is a pipeline for Latinos, Latinas, and Black male educators to begin the sort of segue or development or capacity building to lead in these multiple spaces. So that is definitely important. To your last point about experience, Jose, how has your lens on race and class affected your experience as an educator? And how do you believe your experience has been representative of other educators of color?
Well, something that occurs to me is that, we talk about framing. We need to reframe what it means to actually be a teacher. I think in the last 20 years, for example, we've seen a ramping up of standardized testing as a form of determining whether or not a student is excellent or not. And of course, vis-a-vis like teachers, communities, et cetera. And it's led to a lot of deleterious policies writ large for any number of different folks. And that's why you get scandals across the country, for the better part of the last couple of decades, so on and so forth. But then more relationally, it has reified our disciplinary practices to the point where we again see people not treating children like human beings. And this specifically goes for our Black kids, our Latinx kids. And of course, shout out to Monique Morris, for example, who's quick to highlight Black girls and Latinx girls and Native American girls in her studies, and the work that needs to be done around that. Of course, students who are disabled, and is cutting across race there. And I kind of need to highlight that, because when you think about Black male educators, for example, those of us who are part of the 2 to 3% Black male educators, Asian American male educators, so on and so forth, we constitute about 2% of the entire profession. And then with that said, though, when we get into these spaces, and I've told this to Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan, Secretary of Education John King, didn't speak to the last one, but with that, right, when I get into these spaces of policy, I'm quick to point out that we are often seen not as actual educators, but as overseers. Too often we are in the classroom and we're told that, we're good because we're good at discipline, and that, we know how to control those kids. And those are verbatim words that we consistently hear. Another thing that we hear too is, when we are asked to be promoted, whether it be to a dean or to be an assistant principal, again, we become overseers with a higher salary, right? So white supremacy continues to be, I guess, the pervasive issue that, undergirds so much of this conversation, because as much as so many of my Black male colleagues, Latin male colleagues want to be that educator who talks specifically about their content and their subject area and how they make their classrooms come alive, and you see that in so many different examples, there's still that sense from so many different policymakers that they also have to be the ones to exert punishment. And those are things that I think are worth highlighting, because in contrast, you see the work of folks like Gloria Latson-Billings, Geneva Gay, etc., where they talk about the warm demander. And in my own experience, I've seen that it's the Black women, it's the Latinx women, it's so many of the women in our spaces, and the folks who I guess are non-gender conforming as well, who are the ones who are going to push the lever for us to be warm demanders. I think that's an important part for so many of us who are Black male educators, because we're not given in so many people's eyes the opportunities to be that warm demander that we ought to be. And those are functions of patriarchy as well, right? And so for me, I'm considering how even in so many different states, for example, we have, I think, 19 states right now that still allow for corporal punishment to happen in our schools. 19. Like, we thought we abolished that, and to the contrary, it is still going on. It's still pervasive, and it's still happening for so many of us. And so the role as a teacher isn't about test scores. It's about reimagining what it means to be a full-fledged citizen in this country. It is about assuring that freedom and liberation, whatever that may look like for so many different communities, actually is constituted. And what folks knew in the early 20th century is that, like, Black teachers were often the folks who were able to teach people how they were going to get to that liberation through any number of different ways that they did so as community members. But these days, that's just not the case, because our jobs have been so constricted by a number of things, including like these compulsory tests that, by the way, like do next to nothing with telling me how competent the teacher actually is, right? And all these TPAs, whatever have you, instead of being very thoughtful about what we want teachers to be when they face those kids. And so I'm consistently pushing this narrative, because we need to be thoughtful about the students that we actually serve, and how the students that we actually serve are going to be eventual reflections of the teachers that we hope to become.
So let's stay there in a way. Here's a question that keeps coming up in the Q&A, is around teacher education programs and certification, and these things that are outside of the, not influence of districts and folks, but outside of the direct streamline of power. And there's some legislation even moving in Illinois around hiring and certain elements of what it means to advance more people of color. But I think the group that goes untouched are those larger institutions that hold a lot of power, teacher education programs, larger institutions. You know, I remember some teachers finishing school and not really knowing what professional learning communities were, which I thought is like a simple, sort of broad stream, right? And when you think about, we've been talking about multicultural education, cultural competence, differentiated instruction. Now we're at culturally relevant education. And I keep asking myself, why are we, these are all sort of elements of the same. So as I think about all of the preparation and all of the opportunities around certification, what should teacher education programs be doing right now? And what is the accountability, or should it be, for larger institutions that have teacher programs? Because a part of me is like, waive the cost, but that's not, the cost is not the issue, it's the stuff itself. And I'm wondering, what bold actions would we take a moment to push the educator programs on, so that there is some institutional change around that?
I mean, I would like to share something, and that's that the root of the entire tree is corroded, right? And so if you take, people are like, oh, attack the low hanging fruit. There is no low hanging fruit, because the entire tree is corrupted. So we need to just cut the tree down at the root where it is in the soil. And so if you take that particular approach, then you also have to realize that to Carla's point, the licensure exams are gatekeepers. Someone actually mentioned that about voter tests and like the similarities between these licensure exams and voter tests. And I think that teacher education programs need to be working and lobbying and advocating for their students to be, who are, especially if they can exhibit competencies for doing this work, that they're allowed to do this work or demonstrate their professionalism and their ability to do the job through a portfolio method of some sort, or a competency base. competency-based licensure program or component, because licensure exams are the modern day voter literacy test. They were primarily created by Southern lawmakers as gatekeeping tools to discriminate against Black educators following the Brown v. Board of Education decision. They wanted to keep Black educators from following Black students into white schools. That is why licensure exams were created. So much so that if you look at the history of it, the number of teachers tested by city using special tests, if you will, or licensure exams increased by 65% the year preceding Brown versus Board of Education. And that by 1959, because this is the work that Teacher Impact Collaborative, who I'm working with, are working on getting around licensure exams. But by like 1959, teachers and principals in almost every major city in the South were required to take an exam. And this was done by design. Once again, systems and structures that were created by design to oppose or to push out people of color. And so trying to soften that blow, if you will, or trying to give test prep programs, all of those things do not account for the fact that the entire structure and premise behind a licensure exam is racist and oppressive in nature. So we need to address and attack that. And as Carla pointed out, research shows that most teachers of color are effective with students, but primarily all students actually do better when they have teachers of color. That is research-based, even if that teacher didn't pass that licensure exam. So what does that tell you about what it really takes to be a teacher? That I could regurgitate facts and nuances, or does it really tell you if I have pedagogical skills to teach and educate kids? And so competency-based, performance-based assessments or performance and competency-based licensure or entryways or entry pathways to teaching is what teacher ed programs could be moving into and moving in the direction of, and allowing greater flexibility in policy around licensure exams, if not just getting rid of them completely.
Thank you. One other question, there are quite a few questions in the chat. One is, why is it that equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, HR employees happen to be Black individuals? Why do we think that is? Carla, you mentioned earlier about tokenism as an example. How might we also take that and use that to the advantage of people of color? Any insights you'd like to share?
I would say, yeah, I saw that question on there posted. I think it's a good question. I think it's something that we should all be asking ourselves because especially since last year, there's been just a flow of and an influx of positions for chief equity officers in different places because of folks having this like racial awakening since, last year. And many of us, we've been doing this work for a really, really long time. I don't have like a direct question. I think that for when I think about those roles, I ask myself a few things. What's the weight of the person leading that work? What's the toll on them? What does it take? Because then we put all that weight on that one person and have high expectations for them to change things, right? Just like Dr. Baker said earlier, right? It's like then you become the point person, you become the person that everybody goes to and expects you to create this equitable and anti-racist organization. And that could be what happens is that harm is done there, right? If an organization does not do the work before that, you probably should not have a role for set up before you don't do the work internally. So I think that those are questions that an institution, a district should be asking themselves first. What are we doing internally to change and set up the systems that we need to actually not only hire this person in this role, but retain them and provide the support system that they need to actually shift and change. And it goes to speak to the issue about higher ed programs as well. Like what was mentioned, it's created by design. It's not set up for folks to win. And so there's so many things that need to happen in addition and coupled with other things so that there is change what are the higher prep programs look like? Who's making the decisions? What kind of training does the department chair have? The mentor teachers, are they trained? I work with an institution, and I come in and everybody's looking for me for the answers and asking me everything about the curriculum, everything about how to go about and how to create courses that are focus on equity. And it's a problem because there's so much work that needs to be done internally, and it's not done. So it's multi, I think, faceted and requires a lot of different steps. However, it could be done.
Thank you. Man, I want to ask like 1,000 more questions. Here's one, as we have about 10 minutes left, and what is the gift we can give the people of color to continue the resilience that we know is embedded in us in this work? That is sticking out for me as something like we have people of color who are connecting with us virtually, who are needing some love right now. I remember when the murder of George Floyd happened and being the race and equity guy in Chicago public schools, and the sort of way I had to find space for Maurice, and having some even white colleagues call, figuring out what to do. It was, and I experienced some things as a principal, but it was very different when you have the Twitter and all of these other things and all of these people speaking. What sort of healing or love can we give to people of color? And what is white people's work right now? And I want to give, I think there has to be some give and take, blessing people with something and also pushing people on their practice. What does co-conspirating look like? What does allyship look like? And how do people need to think about that? If you each could take a few minutes, that will be the bomb.
For me, I'm a big fan of, again, the community element and really understanding what the power dynamics are within that community. I think that's what people kind of miss out on, is when you think about like how white people often enter the space of anti-racist space, it often becomes like, well, I know all the words, I read all the books, I did all the knowledge, but then the practices never really shift and never really change. And the elements of power never really actually like do the things that they're supposed to after having read all the books, right? And so that's kind of what Carla was also highlighting too, which is that like we've had this racial awakening, and then it's like, oh wait, we acknowledge that racism exists, but you notice even as you're looking at the polls that there seems to be a waning of sorts of support for the Black Lives Matter movement, because people are getting tired, and it's like, well, this is our life experience, so of course those of us who are educators of color, we're like, oh snap, like we're born for this, like we have stamina for this sort of stuff, and you on the other hand, like you're tired after one summer. So this is like, it's wild. So for me, I'm trying to figure out ways to build that stamina within so many of us, so we can actually find ways to deconstruct. Like it's not enough to just name yourself an ally or somebody who's like read the books and said, well, I want to be one of those folks. It's like, no, you got to continue to do the work consistently, continue to have those check-ins. Don't just do it with your fellow white folks. Try to find folks like, for example, the folks on the panel with us, to be able to be more thoughtful about the work you engage in. So I was talking about discipline earlier. I'm curious what it would look like to actually take that sort of disciplinary focus and say, well, we have that one dean, and make it into something where everyone is able to have a more thoughtful approach to restorative justice, to transformative justice, whatever that might look like, and have everybody feel responsible towards the children that they serve. Those are things that I'm curious about. I'm curious about how many folks are willing to go back to the works of folks like Vanessa Siddle Walker, who were like, Black teachers were part of the community. Great. That means that more of us need to be invested in the communities that our Black and Brown and Native American children all go through, our Asian communities also go through. Like, they need to be invested in those communities and go see what their life experience is like. It is not enough to just go in there and Columbus the whole situation or gentrify whatever that is. You need to go and get a sense of what's happening, and then let folks take the lead and let folks really be thoughtful, because I know that there's a tension, and I'm sure that there's I know that folks, Dr. Baker, for example, could probably speak better to this than I can, but like when you get into that place where you're the only person of color and you're consistently asked to be the one to talk about race, to talk about class, to talk about all the identifiers, when you get to that part where you cross the threshold of comfort and you get into discomfort, then you become trouble. Then it becomes a problem. Then it's like, I paid you too much. And it's like, oh snap, like we got to make sure that, this person doesn't get enough power, because they might actually change my comfort level and I have to remain boss. And so those are things that I'm curious about and how we're going to deconstruct that. But for educators of color, like we're blessed to have so many folks who are doing real powerful work out there. Shout outs, at leaders of color, of course, any number of people who are out there really trying to change the game in terms of creating communities where there are none. And then of course, I'm always going to shout out, folks like the Center for American Progress. We Build EDU, where educators of color are able to tell their stories from their own voices. And hopefully we're able to reframe the relationship between policymaker, grant maker, researcher, and educator, because too often educators are told, oh, this is the only thing you get to do, instead of giving a broad swath of things that they're allowed to do and able to do to transform the system.
Yeah, I could share on that note. I would just add, just speaking primarily to allyship, is that giving folks grace to grow, right, on all sides. So I want to plus one with my colleague Jose mentioned, but I also just want to add grace to grow as we go through this process, because we can't do this work alone. We need to build coalitions across lines of difference if we're going to be effective. And as people of color, we did not create these systems. So we are not the folks responsible for dismantling them. And that's where allyship actually comes in. But we have to remember, and we have to keep at the forefront, that equity work must be human-centered, because we are dealing with human beings, and human beings deserve grace, and human beings deserve empathy for loss, right? And so I didn't always embrace that as an equity leader, because, I come from North New Jersey. We ride or die, we go hard or we go home. But I realized that if we're building coalitions across lines of difference, we're all learning and growing in this fight together. And that we're going to have to do this work, and we're going to have to do it collectively. And so that's kind of where I like to start. And this is important because I firmly believe that, we are no longer standing in a space where different identity groups and movements can be separate from each other. Intersectionality is demanding of us collective coalition building and collective action. And these are the types of moments that give me some resolve and lessen my feeling of isolation as a person of color. And we have to do that. We have to do that. We have to believe in that. We have to lean into equity work as being human-centered, and we have to provide grace to grow. And that's just something that I would just lean into and add, and that our allies need to keep in mind, that these systems and structures have to be dismantled, and the onus is not on people of color to do that, because the onus was not on us that in the creation of them. And so that's kind of where I would leave that for the sake of time.
Thank you. That was beautiful. The grace and growing. I need to hear that. I think that it speaks to how to sustain this work, because it could be so exhausting, and sometimes you can feel like alone, and what do you do to motivate folks? For me, I'll keep it short and simple. I think that in terms of what our white folks, what they can do in order to support and be in community to push for change that we need, because as Dr. Baker mentioned, we need everybody to do this. It can't just be on us, it's on everyone, is thinking about power and thinking of how to relinquish power, to pass the power to other folks. And I think like that is something that's huge. And I think that it's something that can contribute to the change that we need. So letting go of power and passing that on.
There is a lot of gratitude that I have for every single one of you today. Thank you for the way you show up. Thank you for the gift of words and listening. And to everybody out there, we appreciate just this time to share. I will say one of the lessons I learned when the Keystone Pipeline when they were trying to build that over Native American tribal nations, indigenous communities, is that when a group is impacted, they need others to show up for them. And when I started to make some calls to some people, I recognized more and more how we all need to come together. If you say you're about this work, then be about this work. And when it's time to pause and take a step back, you owe it to yourself to take a breath and breathe and relax. So thank you, panelists. Hey, listen. Also, selfish plug, equity.cps.edu to learn more about the equity work in Chicago Public Schools, equity.cps.edu. And to the Hunts Institute, Senegal, I just appreciate this time and I hand it over to you.
No, thank you immensely, Dr. Sweeney, for moderating such a beautiful conversation. I hope it's been as big of an inspiration for all of you out in the audience as it has been for me. It's been rejuvenating, re-energizing. It encourages you to get back out and do this wonderful work. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Tahita Baker-Jones, Chief Equity and Social Justice Officer at Atlanta Public Schools. Thank you to Carla Vigil, co-founder and chief connector of the Equity Institute. Thank you to Jose Luis Wilson, co-founder and executive director of EduColor. And thank you again to you, Dr. Maurice Sweeney. For those of you who want to join us for a following Hunt Institute webinar, please join us for A Closer Look, Meeting the Needs of Students with Disabilities, with representatives from Temple University, the Hechinger Report, the Ability Challenge, and the Rakes Foundation. We're so grateful to all of you in the audience for joining and having this community with us. We hope to see you soon on a Hunt Institute webinar. Thank you, and stay safe and stay healthy, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.